Did Jesus claim to be God? Now, a lot of work of what I do personally is work witnessing to Muslims, and it's the most common question that comes out of a Muslim's mouth. Did Jesus claim to be God? If he did, show me where. Now, it's not just Muslims that make this claim or request. It's actually a very common claim, and it's one that unfortunately I think a lot of Christians feel ill equipped at times to answer, which is a shame because it's very evident that Jesus did indeed claim to be God. However, what Muslims will often do and what your critics will often do is they will engage something called the verbatim fallacy. And they will say to you, show me where Jesus says, I am God, bow down and worship me. Now, I have written material on this before. You can go check it out on Substack. It's just the Layman Apologist on Substack. I've also did little short videos explaining this as well. The verbatim fallacy is something that you need to learn to recognize, first of all, but more importantly, the verbatim fallacy here is that something needs to be said in very specific words in order to be true. But the issue with that is whenever you address the question of did Jesus claim to be God, you're asking that from a modern Western point of view, right? The New Testament was not written in a modern Western point of view. It was written in an ancient Near Eastern context. So when you come to that text, you would not expect Jesus to utter the words, I am God, bow down and worship me. But the question is, did he claim to be God? And the answer is yes. Now, this claim gets repeated so often and with so much confidence that a lot of Christians have started to feel uncertain about how to actually answer it. And they also kind of get this feeling that, oh, maybe Jesus didn't claim to be God. Well, what I want to do in this video is to go directly to the text and ask what Jesus actually said about himself, what his disciples said about him, and what we know about him throughout church history. Because the answer is sitting very clearly in the Gospels, and it is the most explosive and I would say compelling evidence that Jesus did indeed claim to be God. So, we're going to dive into the text. Why the question matters and how to frame it. The claim that Jesus never presented himself as divine is, as like I said, it's one that's almost designed to be a gotcha. That's why they frame it that way, because we've already talked about the verbatim fallacy. This all carries significant theological weight, because if Jesus did not claim to be God, then the entire Christian tradition is built on a misunderstanding at best, and a fabrication at worst. Even worse, the stakes of the historical understanding of Christ are so high that if Christians have got it wrong, then they are worshipping a mere man. Now, the objection is usually stated that Jesus never claimed to be God, but that framing invites you to take a deeper look at it and show that it is a verbatim fallacy. Because the problem with the framing is that it is ultimately anachronistic. It expects a first century Jewish teacher operating within a specific cultural and religious context to make claims in the vocabulary and conceptual framework of later Christian theology, i.e. modern Western thought. And when he does not use those exact words, it's treated as if that he never made the claim at all. But divine claims in a first century Jewish context do not look like a systematic theologian writing a creed in our modern day. They look like actions the person takes, titles the person has, statements they make that would have immediately been understandable to their audience, or in certain cases would be blasphemous to make if a mere man. Now, when you look at this, when Jesus forgives sins, when he redefines the Sabbath on his own authority, when he speaks with the formula, I say to you, rather than the previous prophetic, thus saith the Lord, that's significant. When he accepts worship, when he identifies himself with the divine name in John 8:58, These are all claims that he is making about himself, that his disciples make about him, that his Jewish contemporaries understood perfectly well, and in some cases why they tried to stone him for blasphemy. The response of the crowd in that particular passage is, we know you are making yourself equal with God, and they pick up stones to stone him. Now, let's look at the I am sayings found in John. John's Gospel contains the most explicit and theologically developed Christological material in the New Testament. I would also argue that Mark's Christology is very high, but that's a video for a different day. So these I am sayings are the most significant cluster of data within the New Testament. There are two distinct forms of the I am construction in John. The absolute I am statements, where Jesus uses the construction without a predicate, are the ones that carry the most direct theological weight. In John 8:58 is the most dramatic of all of them. It says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." The construction of ego eimi in the Greek, used in response to the crowd's question about whether Jesus had seen Abraham, is a bare present tense statement that creates deliberate grammatical rupture with the past tense context. Jesus does not say, "I was before Abraham," or "I have existed since before Abraham." He says, "I am," using the present tense to assert an eternal, self-existent being that transcends the historical sequence in which Abraham lived and died. Now, the Exodus background. The Exodus background of this statement is not incidental either. It's the entire point of it and why Jesus makes the statement. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, God reveals his name to Moses as "I am who I am," and instructs him to tell the Israelites that "I am" has sent him. The divine name Yahweh in the Hebrew tradition is connected to this declaration of self-existent eternal being. And Jesus' use of the ego eimi statement in John 8:58 in response to a question about his relationship to Abraham is a direct appropriation of the divine name, and the crowd's response makes the meaning of it absolutely unmistakable. They picked up stones to throw at him. Why? Because under Jewish law, blasphemy was a capital offence punishable by stoning. The crowds did not pick up stones because they thought Jesus claimed to be a very old man. They picked up stones because they understood exactly what he had claimed, and they regarded it as the greatest possible theological offence. Now, John 18:5-6 considers another absolute "I am" statement that tends to get passed over in these discussions. When the soldiers and officers come to arrest Jesus in the garden and he asks whom they are seeking, they answer Jesus of Nazareth. They answer Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus responds to them with "Ego eimi," "I am." And they drew back and fell to the ground. The response of the arresting party to Jesus' simple identification of himself is prostration, an involuntary physical response to something in that declaration that the narrative does not fully explain, but that the reader of John's Gospel, who has been paying careful attention to the "I am" motif throughout, understands as a moment in which the divine name has been spoken and its weight has been felt. Then you have the predicated "I am" statements. They are less direct, but they're equally significant in the full picture they build. Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine." Each of these statements appropriates imagery that in the Jewish scriptures is associated with God himself. The light of the world in Isaiah chapter 60 is God. The good shepherd of Psalm 23 and Ezekiel 34 is God. And Ezekiel 34 explicitly promises that God himself will come to shepherd his flock after the human shepherds have failed. The resurrection and the life is not a capacity that any prophet or teacher could claim for themselves. It would be blasphemous. It is a divine prerogative. So Jesus is not making comparisons or drawing analogies. He is making identifications, and the cumulative weight of those identifications across the Gospel of John builds a portrait that is very difficult to read as anything other than a sustained, explicit and implicit claim to divine identity. Now, the synoptic evidence. The objection to the Johannine Christology is sometimes that John's Gospel is the latest and most theologically developed of the four, and that its high Christology reflects later theological development rather than authentic historical memory of Jesus. Now, setting aside all of that, the substantial debates about the debating the historical reliability of John, the synoptic gospels themselves contain their own very high Christological material that, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, but is just as explosive as anything in John, and that comes from sources whose early dating is far less contested. Now, the controversy over the forgiveness of sins in Mark 2, 1-12 is one of the most significant scenes in the entire gospel tradition, and it tends not to receive the attention it really does deserve. Now, a paralyzed man is lowered through a roof by his friends to reach Jesus, and Jesus' response is to say to the man, "Your sins are forgiven." And the scribes sitting there respond with the question, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" The response is completely valid, because they're giving an accurate understanding of what they have just perceived that Jesus has done. In the Jewish framework and understanding, sin is an offence against God, and the authority to forgive sins unilaterally without reference to the temple sacrificial system, and without even specifying the sins in question, is an authority that belongs to God alone. Jesus does not correct the scribes or their reasoning. He instead demonstrates it by healing the man as confirmation that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. The claim embedded in that entire scene is remarkable, and it is sitting in one of the earliest canonical Gospels. In the same Gospel, in chapter 13, the Olivet Discourse, and its parallels, Jesus is speaking of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Language drawn directly from Daniel chapter 7 verses 13-14, where one like the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days and is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all peoples shall serve. The figure in Daniel 7 is presented before God and receives universal eternal dominion from him. Jesus applies that figure to himself and speaks of his own coming in those terms. Now, this is not the language of any mere prophet or teacher. It's rather language that speaks of this cosmic figure of Daniel's vision. And the high priest's response at Jesus' trial confirms that it was understood as such, because Caiaphas goes on to say, "You have heard the blasphemy." They considered this statement to be so blasphemous. Why? Because they understood it as a claim to divinity. Now, Matthew chapter 11 verse 27 contains a statement that has been called the Johannine thunderbolt in the synoptics, because of how theologically developed it sounds compared to the surrounding material. "All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." Now, that's mutual exclusive knowledge claimed between Father and Son, and it is the language of a unique ontological relationship, not of a prophet or a teacher who has received divine instruction. Scholars across the theological spectrum acknowledge that this saying, if authentic, represents a very high Christological claim, and by the way, it is authentic. These arguments show that Jesus is making statements that a mere prophet or teacher could not make. He is saying to be one with the Father in a way that no mere human could claim. Let's also look at the trial scene in Mark chapter 14. I think verses 61 to 64, somewhere around there. And you see this discussion in Jesus' own explicit response under oath to the direct question of whether he is the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed. Jesus answers, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Now, look what happens. The high priest rends his garments. He tears them. Something, by the way, that actually invalidates his office. The priestly garments were never to be torn. But that's a video for another time. He understood that what Jesus just said, if he were not God, would be blasphemy. And the council condemns Jesus as deserving death. Now the question is, what theological claim Jesus made that produced that response? Claiming to be the Messiah alone would not have been sufficient for a blasphemy charge. But the combination of I am, the direct echo of the divine name, with the Daniel 7 imagery of the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Why? Because throughout the Old Testament scriptures, Yahweh was the one who was known to ride on the clouds. So they understood this to be a claim of divinity, identifying being Yahweh himself. The Sanhedrin heard this, and Jesus says that they will see him stood at the right hand of God. And that was understood by everyone in the room as a claim that was beyond blasphemous. But it would only be blasphemous if Jesus wasn't God. He is. Because here's the thing. Unlike the verbatim fallacy, you can see clearly that Jesus did indeed make claims to divinity. But you have to understand what those claims would look like in an ancient Near Eastern context. Now, the actions themselves that speak louder than words in a lot of cases. Jesus' claims about himself were not limited to his verbal statements. Several things he did in the course of his ministry carried Christological weight that is just as significant as anything that he said. And in a culture where actions within a symbolic and scriptural framework carried enormous communicative power, they need to be taken into account here. So, you have the temple action of Mark 11. Now, this often gets put into what I would say is just a protest of the economic exploitation of the temple. And that's not a wrong reading, but it is really missing the point on a lot of it. When Jesus enters the temple, he overturns the table and declares that the house of prayer has become a den of robbers. Now, he is doing something that in the prophetic tradition of Israel, only God has the authority to do. The temple is God's house. Now, bearing in mind, because something that I skipped out earlier, which I really should have added in. The reason why I say Mark has such high Christology. Look at Mark chapter 1. John the Baptist is the messenger that is preparing the way for Yahweh. But who does John the Baptist actually prepare the way for? Jesus. And whenever you understand the prophecies in Malachi and in Zechariah, you understand that that voice crying in the wilderness was preparing the way for Yahweh to come to his temple. But John the Baptist prepares the way for Jesus. And it is Jesus who comes to the temple. So I thought I would add that in there very briefly, but let me continue. Now, as I said, Jesus here, when he's doing this, he's doing something that only God had the authority to do. Why? Because the temple is God's house. In Zechariah chapter 14 and Malachi 3, they both contain prophetic promises that God himself will come suddenly to his temple and he will purify it. So Jesus' action in the temple is not just simply a protest against this, money changing drama. It's actually messianic and implicitly a divine claim that the authorities' immediate response seeking to destroy him reflects their understanding that something more prophetic than a critique of an economic practice had just occurred. They understood that only God would have the authority to purify the house in that manner. They didn't see Jesus as God, so therefore they treated it as more of a blasphemous statement. Now, the stilling of the storm in Mark chapter 4. It ends with the disciples asking one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Now, that question is not it's not rhetorical. They were genuinely asking this question because in the Psalms and in the Jewish tradition, generally speaking, the authority over wind and sea belongs to God alone. In Psalm 89:9, I believe, speaks of God ruling the raging of the sea and stilling its waves. Job chapter 38 has God addressing Job out of the storm and describing his authority over the natural order. So when Jesus speaks to the wind and the sea, they obey. And the disciples' response of fear and questioning of who he is reflects the recognition that something has happened that can only be truly spoken of God. So you have very early on the disciples wrestling with the fact of, we know from our scriptures who can command the wind and the sea. And they're wrestling very early on with who is this one? The one that we follow. Because early on they're beginning to understand they're not dealing with just a mere man, although he is man. Now, the acceptance of worship is perhaps just the most simple point that we can point towards to show that Jesus is God. Matthew 28 verse 9 records the women clinging on to Jesus' feet and worshipping him after the resurrection. And Jesus does not correct them. However, he does say, "Do not hold on to me because I have not yet ascended to the Father." That's not a correction of worship. That is Jesus simply saying that he has now to ascend to the Father. So do not try and cling to him. Don't try and hold him here. But he does not correct their worship. Matthew 14:33 records the disciples worshipping him after he walks on water. John 20:28 has Thomas declaring, "My Lord and my God," in Jesus' presence. And Jesus receives that declaration and he does not correct Thomas. Instead, blessing those who believe without having seen. Now, in a thoroughly Jewish context where the exclusive worship of God was the most non-negotiable theological commitment you could have, accepting worship without correction is itself a claim of the highest possible kind. The early creed and what it means for the development argument. The argument that divine claims attributed to Jesus in the Gospels represent later theological development rather than authentic historical memory requires a period of time in which that development could have occurred. And the early creedal material in Paul's letter is one of the most significant pieces of evidence against that required timeline. Now, you will have heard me state this in some of my previous videos, but the creed of 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, whose early dating is to within 5 to maybe 9 years of the crucifixion, is acknowledged by the vast majority of critical scholars. And it identifies as Jesus as the one who died for sins, was buried, was raised, and appeared. The identification of Jesus as the one whose death atones for sins itself is a very high Christological claim. Because in the Jewish framework, atonement is something God provides, not something that a mere rabbi or prophet could do. The entire sacrificial system of the Old Testament is premised on the fact that God has provided the means of atonement. A human being whose death atones for sins of others is not functioning as a human being. He is functioning, as the divine provision itself. Philippians chapter 2 verses 5 to 11, which most scholars regard as containing an early hymn that Paul is quoting rather than composing himself, describes the pre-existent Son who was in the form of God and chose to take on the form of a servant, and whose name at his exaltation is the name that is above every name, before which every knee will bow. The phrase every knee will bow and every tongue will confess is drawn from Isaiah 45:23, where it refers to the universal acknowledgement of the God of Israel. But Paul applies it directly to Jesus. And again, Paul's borrowing that from a pre-existent hymn. So this was something the early Christians were already teaching. This is material that most scholars date to the 50s, and at the latest, I would say at the latest they date it to the 50s and may possibly reflect an even earlier tradition. Now, the hymn of Colossians chapter 1, 15-20 describes Jesus as the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, the one in whom and through whom and for whom all things were created, the one who is before all things and in whom all things hold together, the head of the body, the church, the firstborn from the dead. Sorry, I was struggling to remember all of that there. I hope I didn't butcher it. The scope of what is being claimed here is cosmic and divine in its very nature. It is being claimed in a letter that most scholars date to the late 50s or early 60s. And the development argument requires us to believe that this level of Christological reflection emerged roughly 30 years or more after the crucifixion. But that's not what we see. The timeline is extraordinarily compressed for the kind of development being proposed. And it becomes even more compressed when you push the creedal material back to within a few years of the event themselves. Now, the trilemma and its force. C.S. Lewis' famous trilemma, presented most accessibly in Mere Christianity, argues that the options available for understanding Jesus, given what he claimed about himself, are Lord, liar, or lunatic. That the one option that is not available given the actual content of his claims is the option that the revisionist account consistently reaches for, which is a great moral teacher who said nothing about being divine. So you can throw the moral teacher part out the window. You've got three options. He is Lord, liar, or lunatic. Now, Lewis's argument has been criticized and refined ever since he first stated it, and some of those criticisms are genuine. The liar option assumes a level of deliberate deception that requires its own explanation given the moral texture of Jesus' teaching. The lunatic option runs into the difficulty that the Gospels do not present a picture of psychological instability, but rather one of extraordinary coherence and depth. And some critics have proposed a fourth option, that Jesus was a legend, that the claims were placed in his mouth by later authors and do not reflect what he actually said. But as we have seen, the early dating of the Christological material in Paul's letters and the creedal formulas makes the legend option very difficult to actually hold to, and no serious scholar or person does hold to it. Ultimately, the fundamental force of Lewis' argument is still intact even after all these refinements, because the Jesus of the Gospels made claims that are incompatible with being a great moral teacher. A great moral teacher does not claim to have the authority to forgive sins. He does not accept worship. He does not identify himself with the divine name, and he does not promise to judge the nations at the end of history, and does not tell his followers that knowing him is the only path to knowing the Father. Each of those claims requires a response that goes beyond the admiration for Jesus being a great teacher. They demand an answer to the question of who Jesus actually is, a question that Jesus once asked his apostles. Who do you say I am? Now, who is Jesus? He is Lord. We know this from the text. We know this from the historical claims about him. He is Lord. Now, the claim that Jesus never presented himself as divine, it does not survive any careful reading of the earliest documents. It does not survive any careful reading of the early Christian writings we have of Jesus. The I am sayings in John, with the divine name, that carry such a heavy weight that all of his contemporaries understood, that even his enemies understood who he was claiming to be, and they attempted to kill him for it. The forgiveness of sins is a claim that the scribes even correctly identified as a divine prerogative, but yet Jesus claimed that for himself. The trial before the Sanhedrin, or more appropriately the kangaroo court, which produced a blasphemy verdict, did so only because they understood Jesus to be claiming more than being the Messiah. They understood him to be claiming the divine Son of Man. The early creedal material in Paul's letters places extraordinarily high Christology within years of the crucifixion, long before any legend or developmental process could have ever started. And also the actions of Jesus throughout the Gospels, the acceptance of worship, the authority over creation, the cleansing of the temple. All of this carries such weight with it that it is not appropriate to give it to a mere man. It would only be appropriate to give to the Lord. And we understand that Jesus is the God-man, because the revisionist account requires you to dismiss all of that as a later invention, while providing no adequate historical explanation for where the invention came from, when it started, what evidence there is to show that, why it happened so quickly, and why the people closest to Jesus, who would have known what he actually said and did, were willing to die and suffer for claims and things that Jesus did if they had fabricated themselves. The historical evidence points in a different direction, and it's been pointing in that direction since the very beginning of the Christian faith. Anyway, folks, thank you very much for watching. Please do like, share, and subscribe. Christ is King, and I will see you in the next one.
Please like, share, and subscribe to the Layman Apologist to support my treat fund.